There is a sound that no living person has ever heard exactly as it was, but that existed for centuries before it vanished into the silence of history. It was the sound of a Viking longship at sea. Not in battle, not burning a monastery or storming a riverbank, just at sea, moving. The creaking of the strakes, those long overlapping planks of oak and pine, fitted one over another like the scales of a fish, the deep rhythmic drip of oars lifting out of cold gray water and dropping back in. The sound of wind filling a sail of rough undyed wool, a sound somewhere between a breath and a drumbeat. The slap of a small wave against a shallow hull. The low talk of men on watch, voices kept down in the early hours, not wanting to break whatever spell the open ocean had laid across the night. For nearly 3 centuries, this sound crossed the North Sea and the Atlantic. It moved up rivers in France and Russia and Ireland. It carried men from Norway to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland, from Greenland to a continent no European had set foot on. It was one of the most consequential sounds in the history of the world, and it came not from an army, not from a siege, but from the ordinary machinery of a ship doing what ships do, moving from one place to another. This is the story of the Viking Age at sea, not the raids, not the violence that fills so much of the popular imagination when that word Viking is said aloud. That part of the story is real, but it is not the whole story, and it may not even be the most interesting one. The most interesting story is the ship itself, the men who built it and sailed it, the rhythms of a day and a night at sea, the way Norse sailors read the sky and the ocean, the ports they arrived in, the shores they made landfall on. The culture that produced people willing and able to cross the open North Atlantic in an open wooden boat, and the techniques that made it not just possible but, in a strange way, routine. Tonight, we'll travel from the fjords and farms of Scandinavia to the edges of the known world. We'll walk the inside of a longship and understand what it was to live aboard one. We'll follow the whale roads, the Old Norse term, for the open sea across 500 miles of gray ocean. We'll understand what Norse sailors ate, how they slept, how they navigated without instruments, how they kept their ships alive in storms that would have terrified a modern mariner. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank everyone who has been listening to this channel. The messages from people who say these histories carry them into rest, who fall asleep to the sound of the ancient world being described quietly and slowly, are the reason this work continues. If tonight's story helps you find rest, or if it simply keeps you company on a long evening, that is enough. That is exactly what it is here for. Now, close your eyes if you'd like, and let the sea come to you. Chapter 1. The Land That Made Them. To understand why the Norse became the greatest seafarers of the medieval world, it helps to understand the land they came from, because in many ways, the land gave them no choice. Scandinavia is not a hospitable place to feed a large population. The peninsula that today holds Norway and Sweden is one of the most rugged landscapes in Europe. In Norway especially, the terrain is extreme. The country is dominated by a long spine of mountains, the Scandinavian range that runs almost the full length of the country from north to south. These mountains are ancient and hard, worn by glaciers over millions of years into something that is very beautiful and very difficult to farm. The coast of Norway is cut by the fjords, those long, narrow inlets of the sea that reach deep into the mountains like fingers. The fjords are one of the most dramatic geographical features in the world. Some of them extend more than 100 miles inland. The walls of rock rise straight from the water to heights of nearly 5,000 feet. The water at the bottom of these fjords is cold and deep, deep enough in some places that an ocean-going ship could anchor within a few feet of the shore. The fjords created communities, small settlements gathered at the heads of fjords or on the narrow strips of flat land along their shores, places where the land was just flat enough to grow barley and keep cattle. These farms were isolated from each other by the mountains. There were no roads between them to speak of. The only practical way to travel from one settlement to another was by sea. This shaped everything. From childhood, Norse people learned to live with water. They learned to build boats. They learned to read currents and tides, and the way the wind behaved in a narrow valley. The sea was not a barrier to them the way it was for inland peoples of Europe. It was a road, the most important road they had. The Norse began building boats long before the Viking Age, which historians generally date from the late 8th century of the Common Era. Archaeological evidence shows sophisticated boat construction in Scandinavia, going back at least 2,000 years before that. The earliest Norse boats were dugout canoes and small plank-built rowboats designed for fishing in the fjords. Over generations, the technology grew more sophisticated, the boats grew larger, the construction techniques more refined, and the ambitions of the sailors more extensive. By the time the Viking Age began, Norse shipbuilding had reached a level of technical excellence that was simply without parallel in the world. The factors driving Norse expansion were not purely a love of adventure, though adventure certainly played a role. Population pressure was real. As the Norse communities grew over the 7th and 8th centuries, the flat farmable land became harder to divide. The eldest son inherited the farm. Younger sons needed to find another way. The sea offered that other way. Raiding and trading could produce wealth that the land could not. And so the sea culture deepened with each generation, drawing in more men, building more ships, pushing farther out into the ocean. Climate was a factor as well. A period of relative warmth between roughly 800 and 1200 of the Common Era, a period sometimes called the medieval warm period, made agriculture slightly easier in northern Europe, and made long-distance sea travel somewhat less brutal than it might otherwise have been. The Norse expansion happened to coincide with this window of relative warmth, and some historians believe it was one of the invisible conditions that made the longship voyages possible. But the most important factor was the ship itself. Chapter 2. The Longship, what it was, and why it changed everything. The Viking longship is one of the most elegant technological achievements in human history. This is not an exaggeration. For the conditions in which it was built to operate the shallow rivers and open ocean of the North Atlantic, the beaches and riverbanks it needed to land on, the storms it needed to survive, it was a near-perfect solution to an extraordinarily difficult engineering problem. Understanding what made it extraordinary requires understanding a few basic principles. The Longship was built using a technique called clinker construction or lapstrake construction. In this method, the hull is built from long planks of wood that overlap each other along their edges, each plank slightly higher on the outside than the one below it, fastened together with iron rivets. The resulting hull looks something like the side of a cedar shingle roof, with the planks layered like scales. This overlapping structure gave the hull extraordinary strength for its weight. But the genius went further. The planks were not rigidly fixed to a heavy internal frame, the way most medieval ships were built. Instead, the frame, the internal ribs that gave the hull its shape, was added after the planks, and the attachment between planks and frame was deliberate, kept somewhat flexible. The hull was allowed to flex. This flexibility was not a flaw. It was the design. In rough seas, a rigid hull concentrates stress at its weakest points and eventually fails, it breaks. A flexible hull distributes stress across the entire structure. The Longship could twist slightly as it rode a wave, absorbing the energy of the sea rather than fighting it. Sailors who sailed aboard reconstructed longships in the 20th century reported with astonishment that the hull moved visibly in heavy swells, the bow and stern flexing up and down independently of each other. The whole ship alive, in a way that felt alarming, but was in fact the ship working exactly as intended. The other revolutionary feature of the Longship was its draft. Draft refers to how deep the bottom of a ship sits below the waterline. Most large medieval ships had a deep draft. They needed deep water to float. The Longship was designed with a shockingly shallow draft, Some longships could float in as little as 2 feet of water. This meant they could navigate rivers that were impassable to other ships. It meant they could be rowed directly up onto a beach and dragged ashore, completely eliminating the need for a harbor or dock. And it meant they could move with speed and flexibility in coastal waters where heavier ships would run aground. The longship was also double-ended, symmetrical from bow to stern. This meant the ship could be rowed in either direction without turning around, which was enormously useful in narrow fjords and rivers where there was no room to maneuver. If the crew needed to retreat, they simply reversed their rowing. A typical longship from the height of the Viking Age would have been between 60 and 100 feet in length. The beam, the width, was relatively narrow, typically between 15 and 20 feet. This gave the ship a sleek, fast profile in the water. The hull was low to the waterline in the middle, with the bow and stern curving upward gracefully, those characteristic curved prows that have come to represent the entire culture in the popular imagination. The mast was a single pine or fir trunk, stepped in the center of the ship in a heavy block of wood called the keelson. The sail was a single square sail made of woven wool. Some sails were striped in alternating colors, red and white, or red and natural undyed wool, and these stripes served a practical purpose as well as a decorative one. They showed the crew the direction the wind was filling the sail, helping them trim it more effectively. The oars were the backup engine. Most longships had between 24 and 32 oars in total, one for each rower on each side. The oar ports, the small holes in the hull through which the oars passed, could be plugged with small wooden discs when the ship was under sail, to keep water from coming in. When the ship was rowing, the discs were removed and the oars extended through them. The construction of a longship required enormous quantities of the right kind of wood. Oak was preferred for the hull planks because oak is strong, flexible, and resistant to rot. A single large longship might require dozens of carefully selected oak trees, each one shaped from a single length of trunk that followed the natural curve of the tree. The Norse shipbuilders understood that a plank cut along the natural grain of the wood was far stronger than one cut straight across it. The keel, the long central spine of the ship along the bottom, was cut from a single piece of wood, as long as the ship itself. Finding trees large and straight enough for this purpose required searching far into the forest. The Norse knew their trees. They planned ahead. Forest management in Scandinavia shows signs of deliberate cultivation going back centuries before the Viking Age stands of suitable trees grown and selected for future ship construction. A well-built longship was a community's most valuable possession. It could last 20 or 30 years with good maintenance. It was repaired constantly, planks replaced, caulking renewed, iron rivets refastened. Sailors knew every inch of their ship, the way a farmer knew every corner of his land. The ship had a name. In Norse culture, it often had a spirit. It was not merely a tool, it was a companion. Chapter 3. Building and launching a ship. The building of a longship was one of the great communal acts of Norse society. It required skilled specialists, the master shipwright, and his experienced helpers, but it also required the labor and resources of an entire community. Understanding how a ship was built reveals a great deal about how Viking Age Norse society was organized. The master shipwright was one of the most respected figures in any Norse community. He was not simply a carpenter. He was an engineer, a materials scientist, a geometer, and an artist. He carried in his head the complete design of the ship, its proportions, its curves, the exact angle at which each plank must meet the next. He did this without written plans or precise measuring instruments. He worked from memory, from experience, and from a set of intuitions about wood and water that had been refined over a lifetime and passed down through generations. The process began long before any wood was cut. The shipwright would walk the forest, looking for the right trees. He needed not just the right species, but the right size, the right age, the right growth pattern. He was looking for oaks with the kind of wide-spreading root systems that produced strong, curved lower trunks, the curved wood that would form the ribs of the ship. He was looking for straight-grained trees of exactly the right diameter for the hull planks. He was thinking about the ship before a single blow of the axe had fallen. When the trees were selected and felled, work that might take weeks, involving dozens of men to drag the trunks out of the forest, the shaping began. Norse shipbuilders worked almost entirely with axes, not saws. A skilled axeman could split a log along its grain with remarkable precision, producing planks that followed the natural structure of the wood. These radially split planks were far stronger than sawn planks because they preserved the wood's natural fiber structure. The keel was laid first. This was the foundational act the moment the ship began to take form. The keel was placed on wooden supports, held off the ground, oriented in the direction the ship would eventually face. Then the shipwright began to build up from it. The curved stem posts at bow and stern, the garboard strakes, the first planks against the keel, and then, one by one, the hull planks working upward from the waterline. The planks were steamed to make them flexible enough to take the curves required. Norse shipyards used long troughs of water heated with hot stones, a primitive but effective steam bath, to soften the wood. Once softened, a plank could be bent to shape, riveted to the one below it, and would hold that shape permanently as it dried. The smell of that work-hot steam, oak chips, tar, wood smoke, was the smell of a community's future taking shape. As the hull grew, the frame was fitted inside it, ribs cut to follow the curves of the hull, lashed to the planks with strong cord made from spruce roots. This lashing, too, was flexible by design. It allowed the hull to flex without the ribs breaking loose. The final step before launch was caulking and tarring. The seams between planks were packed with twisted wool fibers or animal hair, then coated with pine tar, which hardened into a waterproof seal. The entire exterior of the hull was coated with tar as well, giving new ships their characteristic dark color and that sharp, resinous smell that would stay with the wood for the life of the ship. The launch of a new ship was a significant ceremony. The ship was dragged on wooden rollers to the water's edge, sometimes across a considerable distance, and lowered in. The first moments of a ship's life in the water were watched with collective anxiety. Would it float true? Would the keel sit level? Would any seams open? A well-built ship would settle into the water and simply float, steady and correct, the accumulated skill of its maker made visible. In some accounts, ships were given names at their launch. They were dedicated to gods: Odin, Thor, Njord, the god of the sea, with spoken words and perhaps with offerings. The crew that would sail her were present. The community that had built her was present. And then she was afloat, ready. Chapter 4. The crew who sailed the Longships. The popular image of a Viking crew is a band of warriors, fierce, violent, driven by hunger for plunder. This image is not entirely wrong, but it is far from the whole picture. The crews that sailed longships across the North Atlantic were, in the majority of their voyages, something much more ordinary and much more interesting: farmers, merchants, craftsmen, and explorers. Men who had learned to sail the way they had learned to plow a field because it was how their world worked. The leader of a ship was called the steersman, or sometimes the shipmaster. He was not always a jarl or a chieftain, though powerful men certainly sailed and led their own ships. On a trading voyage, the shipmaster was often simply the man who owned the ship or had organized the expedition, a merchant with enough capital to outfit a vessel and assemble a crew. On a longer voyage, an exploration or a settlement expedition, he was the man with the vision, and sometimes the man with the most to prove. The steersman stood at the stern, working the steering oar, a large, broad-bladed oar mounted on the right side of the ship near the rear. This is where the word starboard comes from. The right side of the ship was the steering board side. This single oar controlled the direction of the ship, and the skill with which it was handled determined how well the ship performed in rough weather. Holding a course in a strong following wind, or bringing the bow through a heavy swell, required strength and fine judgment simultaneously. Below the shipmaster, the crew was roughly equal in status. Unlike the rigid hierarchy of a military unit, a longship crew operated more like a cooperative. Every man rowed. Every man trimmed the sail. Every man took his turn on watch. Social distinctions existed. A well-born merchant's son rowed alongside a farmer's third son, but the shared work of the ship created its own leveling. The sea does not care who a man's father was. A typical longship would carry a crew of between 20 and 40 men for an ocean crossing. This number was driven by practical considerations. Too few men, and there were not enough rowers to manage the ship in difficult conditions, or enough hands to handle all the work. Too many men, and the food and water required became unmanageable, and the ship sat lower in the water, slower and less nimble. The men on a crew were expected to supply their own tools and weapons, and a portion of their own provisions. The shipmaster provided the ship and organized the expedition. Profit, if there was profit, was divided according to agreed shares. This was commerce as much as adventure. The age range on a typical crew was probably wide. Young men, some of them teenagers, making their first deep water crossing, rowed beside experienced men in their 30s and 40s who had made the same journey a dozen times. The knowledge passed informally between them, the older men teaching the younger, not through formal instruction, but through the accumulated habit of watching, helping, and doing. Women sailed on longships as well, though less frequently. Settlement voyages, the expeditions to Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland, were family undertakings, and the ships carried not just crews, but entire households, women, children, livestock, tools, seeds, preserved food, and the objects that made a home. These were not warships on those voyages. They were the Norse equivalent of a wagon train, a deliberate, carefully organized movement of people across an ocean to a new land. The relationships within a crew were intense. Living in extremely close quarters for weeks or months at sea, with no privacy and few comforts, men either learned to manage each other's company or they suffered. Norse sagas describe crew conflicts with striking realism. The small tensions of close living, the resentments that could build over a long passage, the equally strong bonds of loyalty and shared experience that formed when men got through something difficult together. Trust was the foundation of a crew. A man who could not be trusted to keep his watch, to pull his oar, to tell the truth about what he saw from the bow, that man was a danger to everyone aboard. Norse culture placed enormous value on reputation, and the reputation of a sailor was built voyage by voyage, year by year. A man known as a reliable crewman had real social value. His word meant something in a port. He could find work. Chapter 5. A Day and a Night at Sea. What was it actually like to live aboard a longship for days or weeks at sea? This is the question that the dramatic retellings of the Viking Age tend to skip over because the daily reality was not dramatic. It was rhythmic, physical, cold, and quietly demanding. A longship on the open sea offered almost no shelter from the elements. There was no cabin below decks, no enclosed space. The ship was essentially an open boat, a very sophisticated, beautifully designed open boat, but open nonetheless. The crew lived entirely in the open air. The hull was divided by the thwarts, the benches running from one side of the ship to the other at roughly regular intervals. Each oarsman sat on his thwart and rowed from that position. His bench was also, at night, his bed. He slept on the hard wood of the thwart, or on the deckboards between them, wrapped in whatever he had brought. Woolen blankets, fur cloaks, leather covers, whatever combination, kept the cold out well enough to sleep. There was no fixed shelter, but there was the sail. When the ship was in port or waiting out weather, the sail could be taken down and slung across the ship as a tent, a long, low roof of thick wool that kept off some of the rain and wind. Under this improvised shelter, men slept in their cloaks, huddled together for warmth, in the way that made practical sense in temperatures that, even in summer, could drop close to freezing on the open North Atlantic. The ship smelled of tar and wet wool, and the sea, and of the men themselves. Water was always present in the air, in the spray, pooling on the deck planks. The crew bailed constantly. Longships took on some water through the hull seams, regardless of how well they were caulked. The flex of the hull that made them seaworthy also allowed small amounts of water to weep through. Men took turns bailing with wooden scoops, keeping the water level in the bilge low enough that it did not accumulate into a real problem. A typical day at sea began at dawn, when whoever was on watch roused the others. Men woke stiff and cold, stretched, and ate the first meal of the day before anything else. Food on a longship was simple but calculated. The Norse understood, empirically, if not in biochemical terms, that men working hard in cold weather need dense, calorie-rich food. The staple was dried or smoked meat and fish, the kind of preserved food that kept for weeks without refrigeration. Dried cod was particularly valuable because it was extremely dense in protein, could be softened by soaking in water, and lasted almost indefinitely. Smoked mutton and pork were carried when available. Hard-bread flatbreads of barley or rye, dried until they would keep, were the carbohydrate base of the diet. Butter was carried in wooden barrels and kept well in cold northern temperatures. Hard cheese traveled well. Dried fruits and nuts provided variety and some protection against the vitamin deficiencies that plagued long voyages on lesser provisioned ships. Fresh water was the critical constraint. A longship carried water in wooden barrels secured in the hull, and the crew's survival depended entirely on those barrels holding enough liquid to last until the next landfall. Rain could be collected in various ways. Water channeled by the sail into containers was a known technique, but careful calculation of how long a voyage would take and how much water a crew of a given size required was one of the primary skills of a competent shipmaster. After the morning meal, the day's sailing began. If the wind was favorable, the mast was stepped and the sail raised, and the rowers shipped their oars. A good following wind could push a longship at speeds of 8 to 10 knots, remarkable for a vessel of its time. Under sail, the crew's work was reduced, though it was never eliminated. The sail had to be trimmed constantly as the wind shifted. The steering oar required skilled, continuous attention. Men kept watch at the bow for hazards, floating debris, shoals, changes in water color that indicated shallow ground. Rowing was the other mode of travel used when the wind failed, when navigating in narrow waters, when approaching a harbor or beach. It was hard work, but the rhythm of rowing was also calming in its way. The oars moved together, the blades entering the water in near unison, pulling back, lifting clear, feathering forward, dropping again. Men counted their strokes. They sang sometimes short, repetitive working songs that helped keep the rhythm synchronized and made the labor feel less isolated. The sound of those songs, rhythmic, low, monotonous, in the best possible sense, was as much a part of the longship as the creak of the planks or the pull of the tide. Rowing in shifts meant that, at any given time, some men were working and some were resting. The rest was real rest, men simply stopping, lying down on their benches, sleeping in the middle of the day while the ship moved under the labor of their crewmates. This was not considered laziness. It was the necessary discipline of a long voyage, conserving energy across days and weeks rather than burning it out in a single day of heroic effort. The evening meal was the main meal of the day. A small cooking fire could be maintained in a clay or stone hearth box set in the center of the ship. though open fire aboard a wooden vessel required constant attention. Stews of dried meat and dried vegetables could be cooked in an iron pot over this fire. Hot food in the evening was a significant morale factor on a cold northern sea. At night, watches were kept in rotation. 2 or 3 men stayed awake while the others slept. The watch had specific responsibilities: looking for lights on the water, watching the sky for weather changes, keeping the ship on course by the stars, listening for the sound of breakers that might indicate rocks. The watch also kept the bailing going through the night. Those night watches, alone at the steering oar with the rest of the crew sleeping around them, must have been a particular kind of solitude. The ocean at night on the open sea is enormous and featureless, just the sound of water and the cold, slow rotation of the stars above. Men on those watches were alone with the sound of the ship and their own thoughts for hours at a time. The Norse, who wrote about sea voyages, often used the word fear, honestly acknowledging it without shame. Fear of the sea was not weakness, it was accurate perception. The sea could kill them at any moment, and they knew it. What distinguished the great sailors was not the absence of fear, but the ability to keep working carefully and intelligently in its presence. Chapter 6. Reading the Ocean: How Norse Sailors Navigated. Navigation in the Viking Age was one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements of the medieval world. Norse sailors crossed the North Atlantic, reached Iceland, Greenland, and North America, made regular runs to the British Isles, Iberia, and the Mediterranean, all without magnetic compasses, which would not reach Scandinavia until well into the 12th or 13th century. They navigated by a combination of observation, accumulated knowledge, and what can only be described as an extraordinarily refined attunement to the natural world. The sky was the primary instrument. The sun, when it was visible, gave direction throughout the day. A Norse sailor knew the arc of the sun across the sky at different latitudes and different seasons. He knew where it rose, where it set, and where it stood at midday. From these observations, he could determine roughly which direction he was traveling and, by the height of the midday sun, something about his latitude, how far north or south he was. The stars gave direction at night. The North Star Polaris is almost directly above the North Pole, and its height above the horizon indicates latitude. A Norse sailor who could see Polaris knew how far north he was. He could compare its height with what he had seen from home and understand whether he had traveled north or south. Certain constellations were well known to Norse sailors, not by the Greek names we use today, but by Norse names and Norse stories that gave them meaning and made them memorable. When clouds covered the sky, which in the North Atlantic happens with maddening frequency, the Norse had other tools. The solarstein, or sunstone, is mentioned in the Old Norse sagas as a navigation instrument. Historians and scientists debated for many years whether this was a real object or a literary device. In recent decades, research has indicated strongly that it was real, that Norse sailors used crystals of a mineral called Iceland spar, a form of calcite, to locate the sun on overcast days. Iceland spar has an unusual optical property. It polarizes light. When held up to the sky on a cloudy day and rotated, it can reveal the direction of the sun even when the sun itself is invisible behind clouds. Experiments with this technique have shown it to be remarkably accurate. Ocean swells provided another compass. The North Atlantic is dominated by long swells generated by storms in the mid-ocean, and these swells travel across the ocean in predictable directions. A skilled Norse sailor could feel these swells through the hull of the ship, their direction and rhythm, and use them to maintain a course even in fog or heavy cloud when no sky was visible. This was not a precise instrument, but combined with other observations, it was a meaningful one. Birds were a navigation tool as well. Certain bird species only travel certain distances from land. The puffin and the kittiwake stay close to shore. The gannet ranges farther. The flight direction of birds in the evening, when they were flying back toward their nesting cliffs, indicated the direction of land. Norse sailors learned these patterns carefully over generations. The sagas mention that exploration ships sometimes carried ravens birds with strong homing instincts and released them at sea to see which direction they flew. A raven that flew off with purpose was following its instinct toward land. A raven that circled and returned to the ship meant open ocean in all directions. The color and temperature of the water were read constantly. Cold water of a certain deep blue color meant the open ocean. Green water, or water with a slight current shift, often indicated the approach of land or a river mouth. Floating seaweed, kelp, specific types of jellyfish, all of these were data points that an experienced sailor integrated automatically, the way a farmer reads soil or a hunter reads tracks. The depth of the water could be measured with a simple lead weight on a rope, a plumb line. As a ship approached land, the depth decreased, and this decrease gave warning before the hull could touch bottom. The nature of what the lead weight brought up from the bottom, sand, mud, small shells, gravel, told an experienced navigator something about where he was. The seafloor has a character that changes with geography, and Norse sailors knew the seafloors of their regular routes the way a traveler knows the landscape along a familiar road. Latitude sailing, holding a constant latitude by keeping the sun at the same height each midday, was the primary technique for open ocean crossings. To sail from Norway to Iceland, for example, a navigator would sail north until he reached the correct latitude, then turn west and hold that latitude for the entire crossing. This sounds simple, but maintaining a latitude over days of variable weather, currents pushing the ship north or south, required constant attention and frequent correction. The Norse had a concept they called a day's sail, a rough unit of distance based on a typical day's travel under sail in good conditions, roughly 200 to 250 nautical miles. Ocean routes were described in terms of this unit. Iceland is 6 days' sail west of Norway. Greenland is a certain number of days west of Iceland. These were not precise figures. They were rough guides that allowed a navigator to estimate where he was on a familiar route. What all of this amounts to is a deeply embodied form of knowledge held not in books or instruments, but in the body and mind of the navigator, built through years of experience at sea, passed from one generation to the next through direct teaching and direct observation. It was sophisticated, effective, and in some ways richer than purely instrumental navigation, because it required the sailor to be in continuous, attentive relationship with a natural world rather than simply reading a dial. Chapter 7: Weather, Storm, and the Open Atlantic. The North Atlantic is not a gentle sea. Even in summer, when the Norse made their deepest ocean crossings, the North Atlantic can produce conditions that test the limits of any vessel. Storms build quickly. Fog can descend without warning and stay for days. The temperature of the water, even in August, when the surface might feel almost bearable, is cold enough to kill a man who goes overboard within an hour. And the swells of the open ocean, generated by distant storms and rolling across hundreds of miles of open water, could be steep and irregular enough to make even a flexible longship labor. Norse sailors lived with this reality. They did not pretend the ocean was safe. Their mythology was full of the sea's dangers, Jormungandr, the world serpent that encircled the whole ocean and could be felt in its deepest currents. Ran, the sea goddess, who caught drowned sailors in her nets and brought them to the halls below the ocean. The sea in Norse religion was not a place of divine protection. It was a place of power that had to be respected and, if possible, understood. Reading weather was a survival skill. Norse sailors watched the sky obsessively, the shape and movement of clouds, the color of the horizon at dawn and dusk, the behavior of the wind as it shifted or steadied. Red sky at morning is an observation as old as recorded history, and the Norse understood it. A certain kind of mackerel sky, those sheets of small white cloud, often preceded deteriorating weather. A halo around the sun or moon indicated moisture in the upper atmosphere and frequently meant rain within 24 hours. They watched the ocean itself as well. A long, slow swell, coming in from a direction different from the wind, often meant a distant storm. A change in the color of the water, a shift in its smell, a sudden stillness in the wave pattern, all of these were signs that experienced sailors could read. The sea telegraphs its changes hours before they arrive, for those who know the language. When a storm caught a ship at sea, the crew's first job was to reduce the sail. The big square sail was the ship's engine, but in a strong storm, it could become a disaster, catching too much wind and driving the bow under, or tearing loose and wrapping around the rigging. Reducing sail meant lowering the yard, the horizontal spar from which the sail was suspended, and reefing in the lower portion of the sail, gathering it up and tying it off, so a smaller area of cloth was exposed to the wind. In very severe conditions, the sail would be taken down entirely, and the ship would be rowed, or, if rowing was impossible against the force of the wind, the ship might simply be run before the storm, traveling in the direction the wind was blowing and hoping that direction led toward open water rather than a lee shore. A lee shore is a sailor's nightmare, in any era a shore onto which the wind is blowing, where there is no sea room to maneuver and the rocks wait behind the waves. Norse sagas speak of men being driven onto lee shores with a specificity that makes clear this was a real fear, a real experience, and often a fatal one. When the sea grew too rough to row, the steersman's task became one of sheer survival, keeping the bow into the waves, or running before them, preventing the ship from broaching, turning sideways to a wave, which was the failure mode, that could fill the hull and send a ship to the bottom. This required not just skill, but stamina. Holding a steering oar against a breaking sea could require the strength of 2 or 3 men working together for hours. In storms, everything on the ship was lashed down. Barrels were secured to the hull with rope. Shields, tools, weapons, spare wood, anything that could come loose and become a hazard was tied in place. Everything that could be sheltered under oilskins or leather covers was covered. And the men worked, bailed, held on, and waited. Norse religion offered something practical in a storm: acceptance. The Norse worldview was not built on the belief that the universe was fundamentally just or that the gods protected good people from bad outcomes. Odin did not guarantee survival. Thor's hammer could not stop a gale. What Norse religion offered was a framework for dying without shame, and this, paradoxically, may have made the storms easier to work through. A man who had made peace with the possibility of death before he went to sea was free to focus entirely on the work of staying alive, without the additional burden of disbelief that something so dangerous could really be happening to him. When storms passed, there was something like euphoria in the survival. The sky cleared. The swells subsided from violent chaos to the long, deep rhythms of the post-storm ocean. The crew ate and slept, and the ship continued. The danger had been real. They had come through it. This was, in its way, an ordinary day. Chapter 8. The ports and harbors they reached. Not all Norse sailing was open ocean work. A great deal of it, perhaps most of it, by sheer volume of voyages, was coastal trade. Moving along the coasts of Scandinavia, crossing to Britain, following the shores of France and Ireland, running down the rivers of the Baltic to the trading cities of the East. This kind of sailing was the everyday commerce of the Norse world. The Norse were, before they were warriors, traders. The trading networks they established stretched from the markets of Constantinople to the towns of the British Isles, from the Baltic coast to the Volga river system deep in Russia. Wherever Norse sailors went, they carried goods, furs, amber, walrus, ivory, slaves, dried fish, soapstone, iron, and wherever they went, they bought and brought back silver, silk, spices, wine, weapons, coins, from cultures they had never seen. The trading post was one of the defining institutions of the Viking Age. Norse traders established permanent settlements or semi-permanent trading stations at key points along their routes. Dublin was one of them. Founded as a Norse longfort, a harbor fortification, it became one of the most important trading cities in the North Atlantic world. Hedeby, in what is now Denmark, was a sprawling market town at the base of the Jutland Peninsula, where traders from Scandinavia, the Baltic, the Frankish Empire, and Britain came together. Birka, on a lake island in Sweden, was a major trading hub for the eastern routes. Arriving at one of these ports after days at sea was a complex experience. The approach to a harbor required careful navigation, reading the entry channel, watching for shoals, timing the arrival with the tide. Large ships anchored in the harbor, smaller ones were beached. The crew came ashore in ones and twos, some staying with the ship, others going into the town. A market town in the Viking Age was a genuinely international place. In Hedeby or Birka, a Norse trader might do business with a Frisian merchant from the Low Countries, a Frankish jeweler from the Rhine, a Slavic fur trader from the east, and a Byzantine cloth merchant whose goods had traveled overland from Constantinople. The languages mixing in the market were numerous. Norse, an early form of it, was a trade language across much of the northern world, the way English is a trade language today. But traders learned what they needed to trade: numbers, the names of goods, the language of negotiation. The goods were displayed on the beach, on trestles, on the decks of the ships themselves. Weights and measures were universal concerns. Traders carried their own small folding scales, and disputes over the weight of silver or the measure of cloth were constant. Norse law codes show considerable attention to the regulation of trade, standardized weights, rules against selling defective goods, processes for resolving disputes. Making landfall after a long passage was not simply about commerce, it was also about restoration. Fresh water could be replenished here. Fresh food, real food, not dried and preserved, could be obtained. The crew could sleep on solid ground, which after weeks at sea felt extraordinarily good. They could repair the ship, replace a cracked plank, recaulk a seam, reset a rivet that had worked loose in heavy weather. And they could rest in the way that only comes from being safe. The constant vigilance of the sea, the watch, the bailing, the listening for the sound of breakers, could be released entirely in a harbor. Men who had slept in rotation for weeks could sleep through the night, undisturbed, the whole night, without anyone shaking them awake. This was a luxury that the body understood at a level far below conscious thought. Foreign ports also meant the encounter with the genuinely strange. A Norse trader arriving in Constantinople for the first time, and Norse traders certainly did, as the Byzantine records confirm, calling them Varangians, would have encountered a city of 400,000 people, the largest city in the Christian world, with palaces and domes and hippodrome, and the particular dense layered smell of a major city. The contrast with the small farm communities and modest market towns of Scandinavia was absolute. These encounters left marks in Norse culture. The rich textiles brought back from Byzantium appear in Norse grave goods. Byzantine coins have been found in Norwegian archaeological sites. The cultural cross-pollination ran both ways. The Norse took positions as palace guards in Constantinople, and Norse runestones have been found in Greece that were carved by men who died there, far from the fjords they grew up beside. Chapter 9. Iceland, Greenland, Vinland, the Great Crossings. Of all the Norse voyages, the great open ocean crossings to the western lands are the ones that have most captured the historical imagination, and rightly so. The Norse settlement of Iceland, Greenland, and their brief contact with North America represent one of the most extraordinary chapters of exploration in human history. Iceland was discovered, or rather, first reached by Norse sailors in the second half of the 9th century. The island had been visited briefly by Irish monks traveling in small skin-covered boats, seeking solitude at the edge of the world. But it was the Norse who settled it permanently, beginning in the 870s of the Common Era. The discovery of Iceland was probably not a single dramatic moment, but a gradual process. Norse sailors on the regular run between Norway and the Faroe Islands, a chain of small islands in the North Atlantic that the Norse had settled earlier, may have been blown further west by storms and found themselves in sight of new land. Word spread, as such things do. Others went to look. Eventually, settlers went to stay. The settlement of Iceland was one of the largest seaborne population movements of the early medieval period. Within 60 years of the first settlement, the island had a permanent population of perhaps 60 to 80,000 people. They came in ships loaded with everything a new community needed: livestock, seeds, timber for building, iron tools, household goods. The crossing from Norway was roughly 4 to 6 days in good conditions. It was not a trivial journey, but it was manageable in a well-provisioned longship. Iceland became a remarkable society, a republic of a kind, governed not by a king but by a parliament, the Althing, where the leading families came together each summer to make law and resolve disputes. It was, and remains, the oldest functioning parliament in the world. From Iceland, the next step west was Greenland. Greenland was sighted, according to the Icelandic sagas, by Eric the Red, a man who had been exiled from Iceland for manslaughter, which gives some sense of his temperament. He spent 3 years exploring the southwestern coast of Greenland before returning to Iceland to recruit settlers. The year was approximately 985 of the Common Era. He brought 25 ships west, 14 reached Greenland. The other 11 were turned back by ice and storms. The settlers established 2 communities on the southwestern coast of Greenland, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, in narrow fjords, where the climate was mild enough, barely, to support farming. They raised cattle and sheep, hunted narwhal and walrus for their ivory, fished and traded. The Greenland settlements persisted for roughly 450 years, an extraordinary achievement in one of the most hostile climates on Earth. And from Greenland, the next step west was the continent. Bjarni Herjolfsson is credited in the sagas with the first sighting of North America, a man who, traveling from Iceland to Greenland around the year 986, was blown far off course and sighted an unfamiliar forested shore before turning back north and finding Greenland. He did not land. He was a practical man, and he had already missed his destination. Landing on an unknown coast was not on his itinerary. It was Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, who led the first expedition that actually landed on the North American coast. The date was approximately 1000 of the Common Era. The Norse gave the places they found 3 names: Helluland, the flat stone land, likely Baffin Island; Markland, the forest land, likely Labrador; and Vinland, the wineland or grassland, likely the northeastern tip of Newfoundland. In 1960, a Norwegian archaeologist named Helge Ingstad and his wife, Anne Stine Ingstad, found the physical evidence that had eluded historians for generations. A Norse settlement at a place called Lans o Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland. The buildings they excavated: turf halls, a blacksmith's workshop, a carpentry area, a small bathhouse, were unmistakably Norse in design and construction. Carbon dating confirmed they were from approximately 1000 of the Common Era. The Norse had reached North America 500 years before Columbus. They did not, stay the sagas speak of conflicts with the indigenous people they called Skraelings, and the distance from Greenland made regular supply and reinforcement difficult. But they were there. They walked on that shore, they cut that timber, they kept a fire in that hearth. The great crossings were not the work of superhuman adventurers. They were the work of competent, practical, experienced sailors who took the next step west because they knew how to sail, and they wanted to see what was there. Each crossing was built on the knowledge and experience of the crossing before it. Norway to Faroe to Iceland to Greenland to Vinland, it was not one leap across the unknown, but a series of shorter steps, each one extending the reach of the previous one. This is what skill and knowledge and accumulated experience make possible, not miracles. Steps. Chapter 10. The End of the Longship Age. The Viking Age, as historians define it, lasted from approximately the raid on Lindisfarne in 793 to the Norman conquest of England in 1066, a period of roughly 270 years. Home. The Longship Age at sea extended somewhat longer, as Norse maritime culture continued to develop into the 11th and 12th centuries. But the specific combination of circumstances that had made the longship the dominant vessel in northern European waters was gradually changing. The ships themselves changed. As Norse societies became more settled, more agricultural, more Christian, the need for the pure warrior ship, fast, low, open, designed to beach directly and disembark men quickly became less pressing. Trade required cargo capacity. The Nar, the wide-bellied Norse merchant ship, had been the workhorse of the Iceland and Greenland trade routes all along, and it grew in importance as commerce replaced raiding as the primary maritime activity. Other maritime traditions were developing as well. The Hanseatic League, the network of German merchant cities that dominated Baltic and North Sea trade from the 13th century onward, built larger, higher-sided ships called cogs, designed for maximum cargo capacity rather than speed or shallow water access. These ships were slower and clumsier than longships, but could carry 10 times the cargo. For the business of moving goods in bulk across the North Sea, they were simply more economical. The political changes mattered as well. The consolidation of the Norse kingdoms, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, under strong monarchies in the 10th and 11th centuries, brought a different kind of order to Scandinavian society. The loose, semi-independent culture of the Jarls and their personal followings, which had been the social engine of the longship era, gave way to something more centralized. The king had his navy, the merchant had his shipping company. The independent longship captain sailing on his own account for whatever he could find, the archetype of the Viking Age, became an anachronism. The Christianization of Scandinavia, largely complete by the 11th century, also changed the culture in ways that are difficult to quantify precisely, but were clearly real. The Old Norse religion, with its frank acceptance of violence and death as constants, its warrior afterlife in Valhalla, its gods who were themselves mortal and fallible, this was replaced by a religion that placed different values at the center. The change did not happen overnight, and was never complete in the sense of eliminating all that came before. But Norse society in 1200 was not the same society that had sent those first longships out into the North Sea in 800. The longship itself survived in adapted forms for a long time. Warships of Norse design were still being built in Scandinavia in the 13th century. The clinker-built tradition persisted in smaller boats in Norway, Denmark, and the British Isles for centuries more, and persists in some forms to this day. In the traditional wooden boats of Norwegian fjord communities that trace their lineage directly to the Viking Age craft. The navigation knowledge accumulated by the Norse did not disappear, it was absorbed and built upon. The Norse contribution to European geographical knowledge, the discoveries of Iceland, Greenland, and North America, the detailed knowledge of the Baltic, the North Sea, and the coastal routes of the Atlantic, was a foundation that later explorers, however unconsciously, built upon. The names the Norse gave to the places they found have endured in some cases for more than 1,000 years. Iceland, of course. The Faroe Islands, from the Norse word for sheep. The Orkneys, the Shetlands, numerous place names along the coasts of Scotland, Ireland, and England, all Norse in origin, left behind by a maritime culture that moved through and settled these places and marked them with the sounds of its language. The sound of the longship at sea is gone. The actual experience, the creak of the strakes, the drip of the oars, the cold spray off the bow, is preserved only in words, in reconstructed ships, in the careful, patient work of archaeologists and historians who piece together the evidence of a world that lived and worked and traveled and died. but the sea itself is unchanged. The same North Atlantic swells roll down from the northwest. The same fogs settle over the same coasts. The same stars hang above the same dark water. The long routes the Norse traveled still exist, invisible in the surface of the ocean, the whale roads, as they called them, still there for anyone who knows how to read them. Conclusion: the whale roads. Conclusion: the whale roads. There is a line in one of the oldest Old English poems, Beowulf, that describes the sea as the Hronrad, the whale road. The term comes from the Norse tradition, from that same maritime culture that built the Longships and crossed the North Atlantic. It is one of the most evocative phrases in the history of poetry, because it captures in 2 words something very precise. The sea is not an obstacle or a void, it is a road, a path through the world. A place you can travel, if you know how. The Norse knew how, better than anyone before them, and arguably better than anyone who came after for several centuries. They knew how to build a ship that could survive the ocean. They knew how to read the sky, and the water, and the birds. They knew how to manage a crew across weeks of cold and discomfort and real danger. They knew how to arrive in a foreign port and do business, and how to leave and find their way home. They knew how to push west into the unknown and survive it. This knowledge was not the property of great men alone. It was the common property of a culture passed from father to son and mother to daughter and old sailor to young one, in the ordinary way that practical knowledge moves through a community over generations. The Longship was not built by heroes. It was built by craftsmen. It was sailed not by legends, but by men with names that have mostly been forgotten. Men who woke up cold on a hard bench in the middle of the North Atlantic and went to work bailing and sailing and navigating and doing all the ordinary things that keeping a ship alive requires. The extraordinary was built out of the ordinary. This is how it always is. Tonight, somewhere in the world, the North Atlantic is dark. The swells are rolling down from the northwest, the way they always have. The stars are moving across the sky in their slow, ancient rotation. And beneath all of it, in some sense that is not mystical, but simply geographical, the whale roads are still there, those invisible highways across the water where, for 3 centuries, the Longships moved. The sound of them has been silent for nearly 1,000 years, but the sea remembers. The sea always remembers. Rest now. The ocean will be there when you wake.